I'm Sharon Dorr. I'm the publishing manager at Quest Books. And I know that back, I don't remember exactly what date, I think it was in the late 70s, some of you may know, Fritjof Capra wrote The Tao of Physics. Wasn't it the late 70s? Yeah, 78 or something like that, in which he made the, at that time, radical, revolutionary statement that there were certain parallels between quantum physics and mystical insights, the ancient mystical insights, and that do indeed suggest a kind of an integrated, interconnected universe. We are all one. Then, several decades later, in 2000, Quest Books published Amit Goswami's The Visionary Window, in which Dr. Goswami goes Fritjof Capra at least one better, in that he asserts not just parallels between quantum physics and mystical insights, but an actual marriage between the two, a total integration in terms of the agreement about the way things really are. It would be hard to find anyone more qualified to integrate Eastern mysticism with Western science, for Dr. Goswami is a true hybrid. He was born into the sacred Hindu tradition in India and has taught quantum physics in the West for most of his long and illustrious career. And what I love is that not only is he brilliant at synthesis, but even as Ravi Ravindra does, as we've seen, Dr. Goswami talks in an accessible way that even ordinary people like I can mostly understand. In The Visionary Window, for instance, he gives us cartoons as well as diagrams, and he quotes Forrest Gump as well as Einstein. And it's all meaningful, it's all integrated. Anyone who has ever seen the hit film What the Bleep Do We Know, in which Dr. Goswami is a featured expert, knows what I mean about this ability to relate and explain things in an understandable way. Dr. Goswami and Fred Allen Wolf just stole that show. Really, and I haven't talked to Dr. Goswami, but I know that Fred Allen Wolf, after the film was released, he got lots of proposals for marriage over the internet. And I can only assume that Dr. Goswami's fame has also skyrocketed. It's the first time I've ever introduced a movie star. And so it is certainly an honor to usher in this fascinating man, speaking on the fascinating subject of creative evolution. And I'm quoting from your program now, which posits downward causation from consciousness as the guiding motif. I won't repeat any more of the biography in the program, except to say that Dr. Goswami has written many books, of course, several of which we have here, or at least did have here. I don't know how many more we have left. They're selling fast. He is a professor emeritus in physics at the University of Oregon, and he calls himself most appropriately a quantum activist. It is with quantum pleasure that I invite you to welcome him now.
It's delightful to be here. By the way, I did not get any proposal whatsoever for anything. But seriously, I would love to introduce the idea that one of the most radical thoughts in the 19th century was from Madame Blavatsky and Theosophical Society. So we as scientists who were born and brought up in the 20th century always feel very grateful that Madame Blavatsky prepared the ground for such radical ideas as consciousness is the ground of all being. And other ideas such as reincarnation, which is now being revived, and other ideas such as creativity, that is also now being revived. There are two ways to approach it. One way to approach it is what Bishop Capra did, and still many scientists are doing, is to say that, well, science as it stands right now, and the way that most scientists do it, is the way to go. Because that science is so well established that it's going to be right, and that science is based on the idea of materialism, that matter is the ground of all being. And let's just have to live with it, because it's so well established, everybody is supporting it. And then how can we fit these things like spirituality, creativity within that science? And much progress has been made. In the morning you heard a theory called chaos theory, which indeed has made some ideas. And it is possible to talk about creativity and spirituality within chaos theory. But don't forget, it is still not Madame Blavatsky's vision. So Theosophists at least should be a little bit less optimistic about materialist approaches. The question for a Theosophist, I feel, is that is the vision only limited vision? Is it that consciousness, creativity, spirituality, all these things exist, but they exist as an epiphenomenon of matter? Like materialists say, everything, every cause rises from upward from the elementary particles. It's upward causation. Atoms, elementary particles make atoms, make molecules, make cells, and cells make brain, and brain makes consciousness and spirituality and psychic ability and what have you. This is the view of materialists. And however you wrap it up with chaos theory, or you wrap it up with Tao of physics or parallels, it's always the same thing. Is it just matter? Blavatsky's vision is radically different. Blavatsky says that no, it's consciousness really is the ground of being, and somehow all this material universe and the success of material science somehow must fit into that. A third vision exists, which my friend Ravi Ravindra supports, and many others, he's just not alone, is that leave the two alone. Here is a view, consciousness is the ground of all being, and here is a view, matter is the ground of all being, and that works for matter and movement and all things that are outside of us. And consciousness is the ground of being is a view that can live alone in matters of experiences, inside experiences, such as our spirituality, and the two things shall never meet. This is distinct. These are distinct areas of our experience, and they cannot be integrated. I am going to represent the Madame Blavatsky's very radical view. They can be integrated, and quantum physics is showing us the way to do it. How? This is the question. So in the next hour, I'll take you through a way of realizing the theosophical vision. A way of realizing that how it is easy to comprehend, easy to understand within science, within your heart, within your experiences, a complete integration of this wonderful idea that consciousness is the ground of being, and also the wonderful successes of modern science, that this upward causation really does explain a whole bunch of things. What quantum physics says from the get-go, and this is what all other theories miss, which is based on Newtonian classical physics. Quantum physics says from the get-go that there is a fundamental incompleteness in the way that the material world is built. Matter consists of possibilities. Quantum physics is a physics of possibilities which squarely declares that matter, material objects, consist of possibilities. They're not things already. We cannot talk about a table or a chair or a building, even a planet, as being there already. Just the possibility is there. And the question is, what makes possibilities into actual events of experience. Quantum physics allows us to say, quantum physics dares us to say, that what converts possibility into actual events of experience is our own consciousness. Because it is a fact that when we observe, we never experience possibilities. We experience concrete events in our psyche, in our internal experience of things. This is the crucial thing. So objects are possibilities. It is our observation, it is our experiencing it that somehow converts possibilities into actual events. So there must be a causal power involved within us, within consciousness. And that causal power, to distinguish it from upward causation, we call downward causation, taking the risk that people can interpret as a God sitting in a throne in sky and exerting downward causation on matter which is on earth. We take that risk because it is such a tempting thing to contrast, upward causation and downward causation. But the fact is, when you examine the situation, we see clearly that this downward causation can be scientific only if you give up such primitive concepts of God. Yes, it is God in some sense. We are rediscovering God in some sense. But it is not God of that popular Christianity or popular religions. It's a God squarely in the same tradition as Theosophy, as Madame Blavatsky, and the ancient tradition on which Madame Blavatsky's teachings were partially based. So let me take you through how this conclusion is reached. The idea is, how does consciousness, which has to be non-physical in order to talk about it in a serious way, having causal efficacy? Because if it is physical, then all causal efficacy must come from elementary particles only. But if consciousness is non-physical, then how does consciousness interact with the physical? This is why material scientists got into the habit of saying that consciousness got to be brain phenomenon, because this interaction, how consciousness interacts with matter, idea of dualism, this is an unsolvable problem of philosophy. Any interaction takes exchange of energy, but matter, the material universe itself, always conserves its energy. Energy never gets lost from it. So how can the material universe interact with another agency, God, consciousness, what have you, without losing some energy to that universe? This idea has prevented dualism from becoming a serious philosophy that is compatible with science. You can, of course, hold on to any idea. Nobody can prevent that. But dualism is just not compatible with science. We cannot do science with dualism. This is why materialists propose that reductionistic idea. Everything is matter, elementary particles build atoms, build molecules, and so forth. But look at this reductionistic idea with the help of quantum physics. We don't have elementary particles. We have possible elementary particles. Possible elementary particles make possible atoms, make possible molecules, make possible cells, make possible brain, making possible consciousness. Now imagine possible consciousness looking at possible elementary particles. Can a possible coupled to a possible make anything actual? Think of possible money in your bank. Think of possible cars in a car lot. Will coupling those two thoughts ever manifest an actual car in your garage? No. So we come to the realization that there is a fundamental paradox in the material way of thinking about things. This is called the quantum measurement paradox. And materialists, to their credit, did take it seriously for a while, until they realized that the only solution is the one that I'm going to present to you. And then there is a strange silence pervading the physics world. Nobody talks about the quantum measurement problem, or hardly anybody does, because the solution is radical. So the idea then is how does consciousness collapse? The word collapse is funny, but we'll use it because physicists use this, collapse or transform these waves of possibility that matter is into actual events of experience without dualism, without only upward causation, without being made of matter, without any paradox. And the answer is, the radical answer is the same as Madame Blavatsky in her philosophy, that if consciousness is the ground of being and matter consists of possibilities within it. Are you catching the radical nature of this thought? Matter is possibility of consciousness. Then consciousness can choose out of its own possibilities without dualism because it's just choosing of its own. Think of those Gestalt pictures that you sometimes saw. My favorite one has a picture of some lines, and you see an old woman sometimes, you see a young woman sometimes. Have you seen this one? It's called My Wife and My Mother-in-Law. But how do you do it? You don't need to manipulate the lines. You don't do anything to the picture. You don't interact with the picture. You don't exchange any energy whatsoever. All you do is that the two possible meanings are within you. You choose this one or that one by just shifting the perspective of your recognition. If the meanings are within you, you can do that without having any dualism whatsoever, because it's something within you that you are doing. That's a simple answer. So consciousness is the ground of being, of which matter consists of possibilities. Now comes a very radical, even more wonderful in a way, because this one we can verify in the laboratory, consequence of this idea. As soon as you have said that consciousness chooses, this word choice is used, immediately two things happen. One thing is that we get very enthused that our choice matters. This choice of free will has been a tremendous problem ever since Descartes. Is it a serious thing? Do humans really have free will? Now we are finding that, yes, we do have free will to choose among quantum possibilities. So in the 70s, when this idea was first introduced in the rudimentary form, people tried to manifest Cadillacs and other good cars for themselves, with little success, unfortunately. And then they tried to manifest parking lots or parking spaces for their cars, with a little more success. But eventually, people gave up. Something was missing. And that something is very wonderful and very radical also. This something can be grasped if you ask this simple question. Who gets to choose in case there are a couple of dichotomic and contradictory possibilities to choose from? My favorite example of this is, suppose you are approaching a traffic light, a quantum traffic light with two possibilities, red and green. And your friend is approaching the same traffic light from the perpendicular direction. Now, being busy Americans, you want green all the time. But if both of you gets to choose green, there is a problem, isn't there? Now, one solution to this is called solipsism. You are the only conscious being that exists. You may have heard of the Hollywood woman who meets a friend after a long time, gets very excited, invites her to have a cup of coffee with her, goes to the restaurant, has coffee, talks and talks and talks. After about half an hour, becomes aware, oh, I'm talking about myself all this time. Let's talk about you. What do you think of me? Only I exist, everybody else is the fragment of my imagination. Then I am always the head honcho to choose paradox solved. But the paradox has not really been solved. The question, who is the chooser, has been replaced by who gets to be the head honcho. The real solution is radical. It was reached by three scientists, one Ludwig Voss in Australia, two myself at Oregon, and three Casey Blood at Rutgers. And all three of us came with the same wonderfully radical idea, that underneath our separateness, underneath our individuality, we are not really separate. We are all connected, like the islands in the ocean, who are all connected by the bedrock. We are all connected beings, and therefore it's always one consciousness that is choosing. And because it's one consciousness that is choosing, one consciousness can do justice. According to probability calculus of quantum physics, one consciousness makes sure that in a large number of such choices, you will get half the time green, and your friend will get green half the time. And yet, if there was a really creative urgency in one of the occasions of choice, such as you are carrying an emergency patient to the hospital and you are praying, consciousness retains the right to grant you that creative wish. And that's how creativity, spirituality, etc. work. So this way of looking at collapse event, this way of looking at quantum measurement, this way of looking at when we observe possibilities, opens us to both ideas, that probabilistic way that reductionistic physics builds things, that is valid, and that is valid whenever we speak of large number of things and large number of events. And yet, for individual cases of choice, we do have creative choice. We can, in other words, be creative. We can, in other words, be spiritual and transform ourselves, just as spiritual traditions such as Theosophy has always maintained, in spite of the fact that creativity and transformation do not come easy. Then our question is, well, how do we become creative? How do we get into this quantum power of choice? How do all these things fit in? And what is the purpose of all this? What is the purpose of all this? Before I get into it, let me tell you one of the other wonderful aspects of looking at consciousness as the ground of all being and thinking of objects being quantum possibilities. As soon as you have done that, we no longer are confined to the idea that material objects are the only objects of our experience. Of course, they are not. Material objects we sense, but is that all we do? Yes, materialists would love to propose that everything is sensing. But Theosophists have always known, just as the spiritual traditions all over the world, just as even psychology under such great luminaries as Carl Jung, that we do have, besides sensing, other forms of experience which are equally powerful and equally valid and equally causative. Namely, feeling, where we feel vital energies in our body, that Easterners call by such names as chi or prana or ki. We do have thoughts, of course. We cannot deny that. We are thinking beings. We think. That is equally valid experience, and our thoughts have causative power. We'd like to feel that. We'd like to think that. And we even intuit, although that's not such a common phenomenon. But we do intuit, we do allow that some people among us have an intuitive capacity, which goes beyond thinking and feeling. We intuit archetypes or contexts of thoughts and feelings themselves. It's a bit mysterious. But we all recognize that intuition is deeply connected with our creative experiences. So in psychology, Carl Jung was the first one to codify our experiences this way, that it is not only sensing, but sensing, feeling, thinking, and intuition. Quantum physics allows us now to ask that since there are 4 ways of experiencing the world, then there must be 4 kinds of objects. Objects that we sense, material objects, Objects that we feel, we'll call them vital energies or movements of the vital body. In Theosophy, we sometimes call it by astral body. That probably is more familiar to you. It's the same concept. Objects that we think, mental body, and objects that we intuit. In Theosophy, sometimes we make distinctions like higher mind or soul, but it's the same concept. Well, I'll call it supramental because it's beyond the mind and beyond the vital. 4 types of experiences, 4 kinds of bodies to experience, 4 kinds of objects to experience. So this idea, which I call new psychophysical parallelism, these objects don't interact with each other, but consciousness mediates their interaction. When consciousness collapses an experience, it has a thinking component, as well as a feeling component, as well as an intuitive component, as well as a sensing component. Sometimes a couple of the components can be missing, that's okay, but we always have one internal component at least with one external component. An external component can also be missing. And one mystery, of course, of ordinary physics and ordinary science is that how is it that something is internal and something is external? So much so that even philosophers like Ken Wilber have gotten attached to the idea maybe this is very fundamental, externality and internality. That is the ultimate basis of how Descartes divided mind and matter, ultimate basis of dualism. What quantum physics does, most wonderfully, quantum physics allows us to see that no, we don't have to think dualistically, internal and external as separate. Not like that. They are all internal experiences of consciousness. Consciousness is the ground of all being. It's all within consciousness. The reason we perceive some things as outside of us is more subtle. It has to do with quantum principle of uncertainty. Let me make this a little bit clear. Uncertainty means that there is always movement that is going on, quantum movement that is going on. And this quantum movement cannot be stopped. So even when I'm speaking from this podium and it seems very stationary, if you really had a laser beam to find out its position, and you measure it, and then you close your eyes, and then open your eyes, within that split second, this center of mass of this podium will move just a little bit, 10 to the minus 17 centimeters or something like that, which you cannot see, of course, but a laser beam will be able to discern. So things move because of quantum uncertainty. However, the uncertainty movement of things are very muted, very small, because at the macro level of matter, these movements become very sluggish. So possibility waves exist as possibility waves, but they move so sluggishly that for all practical purposes, we always collapse them in the same place, and therefore they seem like we are sharing them in a public way. You are collapsing this podium in the same place as I am collapsing. Actually, between your collapse and my collapse, they do move a little bit, but we cannot perceive it. So we both talk about the podium being in front of a fellow who is talking and so forth, and we all think that since you are all sharing the same experience, the experience must be outside of you. In this way, we become lulled into thinking that the world, material world, is outside of us. It is really inside, but because of that communality of our public experience, we think that it is outside. But when it comes to thoughts, feelings, and intuition, those objects remain quantum all the way because they are not built in the way matter is built. Matter is built like micro making up macro. As micro makes macro, quantum effects become more and more subdued. But mind, vital energy, intuitive archetypes, those things are not made up as micro making up macro. They don't have any structure. Therefore, for them, quantum movement pervades in every situation. Therefore, between your thinking and my thinking, the thought moves sufficiently for us never to have to thought the same thing, or seldom to have to thought the same thing. And so we think that thought is private. You cannot think the same thing as I am thinking right now. Thought is private. We perceive it as private. And because we perceive it as private, we think it's internal. Actually, matter and mind both are internal. But one we perceive as external because of commonality of our experience with others. We share experiences and assume that it must be outside to share the experience. And the other we see constantly that it is private, so it must be internal. In this way, this new kind of thinking is really solving very impossible problems of our philosophy. Hundreds and hundreds of years we have spent trying to solve this internal-external dichotomy. So we can trust it for this reason, that it solves philosophical paradoxes. We can trust it also for another reason, and this reason is fundamental. This reason is the reason that this is science. We can take an idea from this new way of looking at things and then see if we can verify it in the laboratory. That idea that I proposed, not I alone, but with Ludwig Vass and Casey Blood, that consciousness is one, we are all connected at some deep level. That idea in quantum physics we call quantum non-locality. We are connected with non-local consciousness. What is non-local? Non-local is a signal-less communication. Communication without signals going through space and time. In other words, this consciousness that connects us is an interconnectedness that transcends space and time. Now, this idea of transcendence is interesting. It's in Madame Blavatsky's writing. It's in all mystical writing. But in those days, nobody understood it, because dualism is the way we thought. So understanding transcendence was very tough. But now we understand what it is. It's non-locality. It's a connection outside of space and time, so no signals are needed. Here is the mediation that Descartes was looking for, but never found it because the language did not exist at the time. So therefore, if we say consciousness is non-local, it's capable of signal-less communication, maybe we can verify this idea in the laboratory. So take two people, let them meditate to trigger their non-local consciousness. This is the protocol that a neurophysiologist from the University of Mexico, Jacobo Greenberg, this protocol was discovered by him. So two people meditate together with the intention that they will have non-local communication. They will communicate without signals, directly. So they meditate for 20 minutes. After that, they are told to maintain that meditative togetherness, but then they are separated, put in individual Faraday cages. Now, these Faraday cages are or chambers which are which are impenetrable to electromagnetic waves. Electromagnetic waves cannot pass through them, pass through the walls of such a chamber, impervious to electromagnetic waves. So now you have two people who are isolated as far as signals are concerned. Both their brains are now connected to electroencephalogram EEG machines. And now one subject, and only one, is shown a series of light flashes. The other subject sees nothing, doesn't even know when light flashes are going to be shown to his or her partner. What happens? Well, if you see light flashes, your occipital areas in the brain will be active, and if electrodes are connected and the EEG is measuring what the electrodes are picking up, they will be picking up electrical activity very specific to the signals. And this electrical activity, from this you can extract the signal, and you get what is called evoked potential, potential that is evoked by the light flashes. It has specific signature. The other subject is just vegetating. The brain is just vegetating, not seeing anything, should not pick up anything. just noise. And yet, when you do that same extraction by the same computer program from the electrical activity that exists in that brain during that period when the other person is seeing the light flashes, strangely, you extract a signal. And that signal is almost identical in strength with the evoked potential. Not only that, there is often something like 70% overlap of phase. They look the same, up to 70%. And this is impossible to rule out, because this is completely objective. So what has happened? Electrical activity transfer from one brain to another, transfer potential without an electric connection. How can that happen unless we are interconnected through consciousness? Consciousness is choosing out of possibilities that exist of seeing light flashes in the second brain. And brains can non-locally communicate. So when this experiment was first done in 1993-94, it did seem very incredible. But since then, 4 or 5 other groups have verified this very data. One in England, even one in America at Bastyr University in Seattle by Liana Standish and her group. So in my mind, this is directly experimental proof for the existence of God. This is why one of my slogans is that the scientific evidence for God already exists, so what are you doing about it? The existence of God is no longer an issue. It's proven scientifically, theoretically, and experimentally. So what are we doing about it? And that's the basis of quantum activism. Let's do something about it. So what can we do about it? Well, what is the door to which quantum physics opens us to? And that door is creativity, I already told you. The Newtonian world, chaos theory or not, other ways of looking at or not, is a determined world. We are objects. We don't really have free will. Things happen because of material interactions. We may feel like we have free will, that I'll grant you. But there is really no downward causation in that way of looking at things. There cannot be. Only seemingly downward causation, appearance of downward causation. In the Blavatsky view, in the view that quantum physics is supporting, in the mystical view, our downward causation is real. We really can be creative if we knew how to connect to that one consciousness from which creativity comes. So it's all a question of doing spiritual work, isn't it? What mystics are saying. It's all a question of transforming, isn't it? Because if we knew how to reconnect, if we knew how to religere, that word religion comes from religere, which is the same thing as reconnect. Somehow we have lost the connection to that bedrock. We have become too individual. We are too concerned with the part that shows above the ocean. We're not so concerned about the deep part that lies deep within. If we could discover it, how to discover it? Quantum physics is so wonderful that it suggests ways of how to discover it completely in consonant with what scientifically we are discovering about the phenomenon of creativity. Creativity researchers have shown for quite a while that creativity consists of 4 stages. The first stage is called preparation. You prepare, you read, you study, you listen to lectures, you look at films, data, what have you. Do yoga, you meditate. But then creativity researchers find that it's very strange. All preparation, people who just go on preparing, they are not so creative. Somehow a second stage is involved, and this is where people get a little lost, because this second stage doesn't make any sense. This stage is simply relaxation. doing nothing. Let the grass grow by itself. Doesn't make any sense to the conceptual mind. If one is not doing how can one do creative stuff? This is just saying that will just be. Don't do anything. Very strange notion. Quantum physics gives us a reason, rationale behind this. If thoughts are quantum objects, what happens when we are not doing anything, when we are not thinking? In between thinking, remember, thoughts are possibilities. So as possibility objects, they would spread like waves. Quantum objects are waves of possibility. They spread in between, they move in between our collapsing, in between our experiencing them. So the more we relax, the more they expand. Of course, if we relax too much, then we would forget about the problem. That's not so good. So it's walking a tightrope, no question. We have to have a balance between doing and being. And of course, what happens, when we deeply examine it, we allow the quantum waves to proliferate, and then we sometimes choose. But choice often does not lead to the right answer because it's not time yet. So what we have to do is to carry out this do and be alternatively many times over. So the new slogan is that do, be, but there is an intermediate way, do, be, do. Which is the way of the creative. This is the way of the creative. Alternative doing and being in such a way that it becomes part of our pattern. What happens when we are? Well, nothing happens if we are not interested in changing. Nothing happens because ego, our individuality, keeps such a strong influence on what possibilities we process that we tend to process the same possibilities over and over. What flavor of ice cream is it going to be? Chocolate or vanilla? No, I like vanilla. So I take vanilla every time. And you like chocolate, you take chocolate every time. This is the way we perpetuate the same possibility, so much so that all of us do unconscious processing, as this phenomenon of being is called in psychology, because it's processing without being aware of it. This is the way we perpetuate the sameness of our ego. I sleep every day, every night, 6 to 8 hours. But when I wake up, I find the same Amit is still waking up. Why? Why am I not transformed? Because my ego is processing the unconscious stuff also. The ego is processing the quantum possibilities, and it don't allow the new. So somehow we have to bring the new. How do we bring the new? Well, one way that the ancients found is that if we change our physical circumstances, like renunciate, go to the forest, and start taking on new experiences, that certainly will change possibilities. These possibilities of samsara has to give way to possibilities of nirvana without any desire, because in the forest, what can you desire? There's nothing to fulfill it with. That was one way. In modern life, it's more complicated. But still, we do get situations of conflict. One such conflict is when you meet somebody with whom you want to have an intimate relationship. Intimacy is disaster. It's very conflict-producing. It reminds you of the picture that Picasso became famous for, the Minotaur, which is at once a beast and human being, and at once has the olive branch and dagger. That's what intimate relationship is like. Sometimes it's olive branch, sometimes it's the dagger. The intimate enemy, as somebody has called it. I was so pleased looking at a movie called The Wedding Date recently. And it says, the hero says to the heroine, I want to marry you because I would rather fight with you than blah, blah, blah. I would rather fight with you. So if this idea is accepted, what does fighting accomplish? It keeps possibilities, new possibilities going without resolution. See that? Without resolution. So the whole trick is to allow possibilities without bothering to resolve them with ego's past experiences and past contexts of thinking. If we can do that, who comes to process them? Who are we really? We are that one consciousness really, that deep consciousness that Blavatsky knew and all mystics of the world know directly. We are that. This is what the Upanishads say, and any of us can verify, as Jesus did. My Father and I are one. We are that. So then, God comes and processes our unconscious possibilities that has the new components in it. In this way, a situation builds in which God and human being reach out to each other, as Michelangelo knew very well. So he codified this in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, became the famous picture of God and Adam reaching out to each other. And this is what happens in creativity. In being, God processes. In doing, the ego processes. And it's a dance between God and ego. In this way. If we could learn this, which some psychologists now call a flow experience, if we could learn this, if we could learn how to flow, how to live life as a flow, then it is within the reach of all of us to have God consciousness, to have a creative consciousness, to have quantum leaps regularly in our life. Now, why? Why should we do that? This is the ultimate, essential question. Why should we bother to be creative? Aren't we doing okay as we are living? Yes, we are doing okay. Some of us have a little more pain than others. But truly, for modern human beings, the idea of suffering as a motivation for creativity or spirituality is just not enough. So materialists try to entice us with rewards for creativity. And that's okay. That goes so far. You can be a star if you are creative. You can be famous if you are creative. You can have a lot of money if you are creative. So some of us are enthused by that enough to actually be creative in that way. But there's a catch in this. The creativity of the kind that you get into can be a little compromise, because creativity also has its own limits. One can be creative within the old by just combining old and discovered context and inventing new context. In other words, it's just manipulating what is already known. And this is the kind of creativity that gets rewarded by society very quickly, because we all have use for this kind of creativity. It's like discovering postum, those little slips which has glue on it. Discovering new kind of glue that will be just the right kind of adhesiveness so that you can take it off and yet paste it again. The person who discovered it, invented it, became a millionaire overnight. But is it an Einsteinian kind of discovery? No, unfortunately not. Is it any transformational discovery that the great mystics of the world undergoes? No. This person remained the same. So creativity also is compromised when we are using creativity for situational problem solving. If we want to be fundamentally creative, then only God is necessary. Otherwise, we can just be manipulative with our learned context, and we are just using the ego in very clever ways. That is fine. I'm not discouraging it. But if you want to be with God, if you want to recognize the God potential within you, if you want to see how far you are capable of, if you want to explore your total potential, then you are just compromising yourself. But then also the question, why should you do? Why should you do it? Because it takes years and years. It took Einstein 10 years to discover the theory of relativity. So we say, well, only Einsteins could do it. Only mystics, they also spend years and years in those caves and meditating away. Only they could do it. We can't do it. Blavatsky could do it because she was a Russian. How can we Americans do it? We can't do it. We don't have time. We are modern Americans, right? We compromise. But there is a very good reason that some of us do it. I think we have been missing it, but there is a very good reason that some of us, in spite of all this rationalization that exists, come to such meetings, get enthused, and become creative when we go back to our homes. We cannot help it, but we don't know why we are doing it. Although nobody is going to praise us immediately, nobody is going to say that, well, we lift you to internet fame overnight because you decided to be a theosophist and explore creativity. It's not going to be like that. Being creative is not just writing a book and immediately finding that you are famous overnight or you have a whole bunch of money. It's not like that. So why do we do it? Well, it's becoming very, very clear now that we do it because there is an evolutionary pressure. There really is something called evolution that is going on, and it's not Darwinian. Darwin discovered, and it was a powerful discovery at the time he discovered it, that there is a component of evolution which proceeds by chance and necessity. There is a component of evolution which proceeds by chance mutations of objects called genes within us, and then nature selecting out of these variations through the criterion of survivability, which ultimately translates as fecundity. Whoever produces most offspring gets to survive. That is the criterion. Chance and necessity of survival. This theory became very popular for historical reasons because there was a rift between science and Christianity at the time, and scientists saw the advantage, opportunity of forever demolishing the Christian worldview out of their system. So there was a big triumph of science over religion at the time. After about 150 years of Darwinism, it has become clear to most people, even many biologists, that Darwinism is not a very good theory. For a variety of reasons, which I don't have time to get into. So, what should Darwinism be replaced with? And what are the biggest criticisms of Darwinism? These are questions we should ask. If evolutionary pressure of a new kind exists, and that is what our motivation to transform ourselves or to be creative, then we better find a solid reason for such evolutionary pressure to exist. Because in Darwinism, there is no such evolutionary pressure on us. If Darwinism gave us evolutionary pressure, then we should all try to reproduce as much as possible, like Darwinism says. But we are moving in the opposite direction, actually. Before, in this culture at least, the males were quite unwilling to reproduce, strangely enough. But women, because Darwinism says the opposite. Darwinism says males have a reproductive agenda. They want to reproduce as much as possible. They have a harem complex. But in modern societies, we don't find that. We find actually the women that held on to family and breeding children and so forth. But now even women are not doing it. I'll come back to that a little bit later. There is reason for it. This is all consistent with evolution. This is the strange thing. When you look at evolution in a new way, we find reasons for our obvious behavior that is going on in our society. So, what is Darwinism's greatest fault? Darwinism does not explain the fossil data. The reason that Darwinism is constantly criticized by people who are of fundamentalist Christian dogma called creationists, the reason that they dared to criticize Darwinism if it was such an objectively accepted biological theory, people have to be pretty courageous to go against that theory. Why do they have such audacity? The simple reason is that Darwinism doesn't hold up against data. Darwinism appeals to scientists because it is consistent with materialist dogma. But it's dogma versus dogma. That's all you have. One hand, you have the Christian dogma that evolution occurs according to biblical Genesis. God created the world, all these species, all together at the same time. Species did not evolve from each other. On the other hand, you have the dogma of Darwinism, that species evolved from species and guided by chance and necessity. But neither theory really agrees with data. The first one doesn't agree because obviously we have geological time and there is evolution, fossil data over billions of years. Pretty obvious from the data. But it is equally obvious that it does not work like chance and necessity in a continuous, gradual manner either, because the data shows very peculiarly that evolution is not this continuous, gradual like chance and necessity tells us. Instead, evolution is punctuated. And by that what I mean is that in the continuous prose, there are punctuation marks, commas and periods. And Darwinism doesn't make any room for those. You can imagine scenarios. Such scenarios are sometimes called geographic isolation and so forth. But even biologists feel uncomfortable with those scenarios. They're just scenarios. There's no way you can verify such ideas. So what are these punctuation marks? How do they come about in evolution? Now I urge you to think of evolution from a consciousness point of view. From a consciousness point of view, it can only be evolution of consciousness itself in manifestation. First of all, recognize that in the unmanifest, consciousness is perfect. A perfect entity cannot evolve, right? Perfect entity cannot evolve. Perfection eliminates evolution. Another way to look at it is that all possibilities are included. If all possibilities are included, then past, present, future are all included. Therefore, nothing can happen. This is the nothing happens consciousness. The ultimate being, true, but in the ultimate being, nothing can happen. So the being has to be compromised. This is called involution of consciousness. Limitations have to come. And these limitations are what produces us those various bodies that I spoke about earlier. The supramental body of laws, body of context, the mental body of meaning, the vital body of feeling, and then finally, material body of sensing. But what does the material do then in the schema of things? Well, material makes representations of the subtle. Material world, material objects make representation, like hardware in a computer makes representation of our mental thoughts that we call software. So physical similarly make representations of the vital and representations of the mental, and that's how evolution proceeds. In this new way of evolution, why do we evolve? Because the elementary representations of God are elementary. Representations have to improve because God would like to have better and better representations of godliness. So we evolve not because chance and necessity, survival, that kind of evolution also exists, but that's a minor, secondary aspect of evolution. The primary aspect of evolution is creative, to make better and better representations. So the same thing of evolution must show up in the way we are creative. If we do this do life, doing and being alternately, we find that once in a while we discover something new. And when that discovery comes, it comes acausally. It comes as a sudden experience, a surprise experience, like a aha. The moment I didn't know, and this moment I know. It's a surprise, discontinuous experience that physicists call quantum leap. When an electron jumps from one orbit of the atom to another orbit, it does not go through the intervening space. It just does it. Like that slogan, just do it. It just does it. Quantum leap. So similarly, evolution occurs in the same way with Darwinian events, continuous events, periodically punctuated by quantum leaps of evolution, in which consciousness creates a better way of representation, better way of representing the vital, a better organ, a new organ for experiencing. Ultimately, the brain evolves, and now even meaning, not only feeling, but even meaning can be processed. This is the job of the mind. Now, mind can be mapped in manifestation. So we have mind mapping, we are mind mappers. This is what human being is about. The brain took off and evolved to such bigness of the neocortical part of the brain beyond the primate capacity that suddenly we developed the capacity for languages, we developed the capacity for individuality. All this is achievement of the mental era. We have been getting better and better in meaning processing. So we started with primitive culture, in which we are hunters and gatherers, and the male and the female worked differently, men being the hunters and the female being the gatherers. We had a separation of labor, so to speak. And males dominated a little. Not a little, a lot. But that was to be expected because they are doing the so-called, quote-unquote, hard job. Women are just sitting around and gathering. But then at the second stage, something very interesting happened. We discovered what is called horticulture, using little instruments to dig up and sort of make primitive agricultural things. The labor involved was so little that men and women both could do it. And this is sometimes called paradise, because men and women both become equal. Women's gods were as much allowed as male gods in our psyche. And we really lived very equitably. So this is often, feminists call this the golden age of humanity, and with some justification. Men and women both were processing feeling. But then a third stage came when we started becoming rational. We started processing meaning of meaning. The first stage is meaning of physical, that's the hunter-gatherer stage, because we are just hunting and gathering physical things. So our mind is only giving meaning to the physical world, physical mind. Second stage is vital mind. We are giving meaning to feelings. And we are very equal at that time. It's like living in paradise. Now, we discover meaning, how to investigate meaning of meaning itself, abstract thinking. This is synonymous with the agricultural revolution because huge instruments were discovered for agriculture, like the plow, and immediately men again got the upper hand because they are doing the more difficult job. So men never allowed the women to process meaning. It's very interesting. Women didn't like it, of course, but they were helpless because they have to rear the children anyway. They cannot live feeling completely alone. So men took advantage of that and denigrated them to processing of feeling, processing of the vital to the vital mind. In the Bible, this is very interesting because I was giving this talk at one place and somebody said, the Bible, biblical apple story, is exactly like what you're describing. So we brought a Bible and we rechecked the story, and indeed it is so. It's very interesting. You know this apple story, right? And Eve bites the apple. But what is the apple of the tree of knowledge? And it's knowledge that separates. So what happens is that we think that that's where the story stops. But actually, the story doesn't stop there. There's a little bit more addendum to the story, which is that Adam is banished from paradise, but not Eve. It never says that Eve was actually banished, although we sort of implicitly assume that. So Eve is still living in the paradise because in the feeling way of doing things, we are very connected. We are still connected a little bit in our feeling. That's why we pick up each other's negative feeling, even sometimes each other's positive feeling. Feeling, in fact, is much more non-locally connective than thinking. When we become thinking beings, we really become separate. So Adam bought into separateness, but not Eve. But after a few thousand years of this going on, women felt that they are being deprived of something that has value, and rightfully so. Meaning processing is also very important. That's the job of consciousness too. God wants to process meaning, and God wants every one of us to process meaning. So women finally in the 20th century said that enough of this. Why should men have all the advantage of processing meaning? We want some of the pie also. And they claimed it, and now women process meaning, and now women don't want to get married, don't want to get into feelings. Career is the primary thing also for women. What have we forgotten in this? We have forgotten that we have to integrate the feeling. Men have been ignoring that for ages, and that's not to be condoned, of course. But that is no reason for women to give up feeling also. Then humanity cannot evolve anymore, because the primary rule of evolution is that the previous stage must be integrated. We never integrated our vital mind within the rational mind. Feeling and reason was never integrated, and this is why our evolution is not occurring anymore. That plus the idea that materialism has taken over our thinking, our science, our way of looking at things. So my urge to you today, and I'm just finishing my time, I'm happy to note. So my urge to you today is that please pay attention. Attention to two things. First of all, attention to the fact that materialist philosophy got to be shifted towards a philosophy of consciousness, primacy of consciousness. Materialist philosophy, primacy of matter, must give away, because our evolution cannot proceed, does not proceed in the materialist basis. Unless we understand the nature of evolution, true nature of evolution, which is an evolution of consciousness, or how consciousness is represented, it obviously harms our evolution. We got to have right thinking. We got to have right worldview. And that right worldview is theosophical worldview. Consciousness is the ground of all being, not the materialist worldview, although materialism is successful, no doubt. But the consciousness worldview incorporates the materialist successes completely. None of the materialist success is denied. Matter is part of consciousness, just the way of looking is different. Every success of the materialist is kept, is preserved in the consciousness way of looking at things, but not vice versa. In the other way, materialist way, only upward causation is acknowledged, not downward causation. In the way of consciousness way of looking at things is both downward and upward causation. Knowing that, recognize right thinking. But the second part of what I urge to you is right living. And the right way to live is not only that do, be creative, But right way to live is also to integrate thinking and feeling. Right now, we are not doing it. Right now, not only our men have lost paradise, even women have started losing paradise of that connectedness. Right now, we are all tremendously suffering from this individual egotism. We cannot accommodate others anymore. This is why we fight, even in this 21st century, when it is obvious from so many points of view, it is obvious that fighting is disaster. Even so, we fight, because we don't know any other way of resolving negative emotions, resolving conflicts. We have not discovered the energies of love. And we have to, so that evolution can proceed. If we start right thinking and right living together, then we have become a quantum activist. Thank you very much.